The Magna Carta, the Black Death, and the 100 Years' War all contributed to making this era of history one of the most interesting and memorable in all of history. But how well-versed are you really in the subject of the Middle Ages? With that said, we will share 10 facts about the time period that may come as a surprise to you. They weren't all knights or serfs or clergy. Even though some writers from the Middle Ages depicted their society as being split into 3 orders, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who labored. This representation of their civilization became increasingly erroneous after roughly the year 1100. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe had a significant surge in population, which resulted in the expansion of the continent's cities and towns. During this time span, London had roughly the same level of growth as Paris did, which was approximately 10 times. People in the cities worked in a wide variety of professions, including but not limited to the following: merchants, salesmen, carpenters, butchers, weavers, food sellers, architects, artists, jugglers, etc. And in the rural areas, it was not at all the true that everyone was a poor serf, which is to say someone who is unfree and is connected to the land. Many peasants were free men and women who owned their own property, but even those peasants who were unfree in some sense nonetheless purchased and sold land and goods in the same manner as other free men. This was true for both men and women. There was little doubt that some serfs lived in deplorable conditions, but this was by no means the norm. People had the vote. Okay, at least for some of the people. A vote in local politics rather than one for a national representative government, which in reality did not exist in medieval times. In the 12th and 13th centuries and beyond in France, many towns and villages were managed on a local level as a commune. During this time, there were frequently annual elections for consuls and councillors, in which the majority of the male inhabitants were eligible to vote. In the city-states of northern Italy, elections and government were conducted using a more convoluted system, and there were multiple tiers of elected officials. In most cases, women were not permitted to run for public office or cast votes, but a few of them were acknowledged in the charters of liberties that French cities were quite pleased to possess. The church didn't conduct witch hunts. The widespread persecution of suspected witches, known as witch hunts, and the collective paranoid response to the archetype of the wicked witch are not characteristics of the medieval period, but rather of the early modern period, specifically the 16th and 17th centuries. There were occasional witch trials during the Middle Ages, and these became more prevalent in German-speaking areas around the 15th century. However, the authorities that were performing the prosecution were nearly exclusively civic authorities rather than ecclesiastical ones. Churchmen spent most of the Middle Ages preaching that magic was pointless nonsense that couldn't do anything. This was the primary message that they spread about magic. Heinrich Kramer's intention, when he penned the infamous Malleus Maleficarum in the latter half of the 15th century, was to make an effort to convince people of the existence of witches. In point of fact, the book was first rejected by the church, and even in the early 16th century, inquisitors were admonished not to believe everything that it stated because of what it said in the book. They had a renaissance and invented experimental science. When people refer to the Renaissance, they are typically referring to the extremely self-conscious adoption of classical models that can be found at the end of the Middle Ages in literature, art, architecture, and study. It is common practice to consider this to be one of the ways in which we transitioned from medieval to early, modern ways of thinking. In point of fact, however, medieval thinkers also experienced a renaissance of classical learning and eloquence during this time period. This occurred in the 12th century, and its success was largely dependent on the dissemination of works by Aristotle and other ancient authors through Arabic thinkers and translators. One of the results was that it prompted an inquisitive and contemplative approach to the physical world, and as a result, it caused Roger Bacon, amongst other people, to think about how one might observe and experiment with the physical world in order to understand more about it. They traveled and traded over very long distances. It's possible that most people in medieval times didn't move very far from where they lived, especially those who lived in rural areas. This was especially true for persons who lived in rural areas. However, this would be the case with a significant number of people who lived into far later ages as well. It is not true, however, that individuals living in the Middle Ages never went anywhere. Many people went on pilgrimages, traveling hundreds or even thousands of miles to reach their destinations. Those who were engaged in commerce also traveled extensively, bringing disparate regions of the world together through the exchange of goods, despite the vast distances involved. Silk from China, spices from Asia that were carried to Europe via the Middle East, amber, and furs from the Baltic. These are only a few examples of the kind of high-status items that were delivered from very far coastlines to diverse European regions, even as early as the early Middle Ages. A handful of the more adventurous travelers even kept journals detailing their travels. In his book, Journey to the Eastern Parts of the World, William of Rubruck details his three-year voyage, which began in 1253 and took him across the territories that are today known as Ukraine and Russia. There was also immigration during the Middle Ages, despite the fact that residents of medieval England did not always extend a warm welcome to those from Wales, Scotland, and Ireland who came to settle there. They had some great folk customs. Christianity either actively shaped or played a significant role in the formation of a significant portion of the Middle Ages public culture. However, there were also certain peculiar practices that were followed, which were generally sanctioned by the church but may have had more ancient origins. The rolling of burning barrels down a hill on the evening of Midsummer's Eve was one tradition, which was observed in many different regions across Europe. Another tradition was to toss wheat over the newlywed couple's heads as a sign of good luck. It was also standard practice to generate money for charitable causes by hosting a help ale, which consisted of producing a batch of ale, inviting a large number of people to a party where they would drink the ale, and collecting donations. There were probably a number of practices that, from our vantage point, appear to be examples of superstitions. These practices typically involve requesting supernatural aid in order to ward against illness or ensure a successful harvest. The midsummer celebrations, on the other hand, as well as the ales, sound like they were a lot of fun. You didn't have to get married in church. Those who wanted their marriage to be solemnized would typically do it at the gate to the churchyard. In point of fact, you almost probably did not get married in the church. But regardless of the circumstances, engaged couples did not require a church, a priest, the banns to be read, or any other component of the religious ceremony. The church most definitely desired for individuals to engage in these activities. Beginning somewhere about the 12th century, it began to assert that marriage constituted a formal sacrament, meaning that it entailed God creating a change within the world. In actuality, however, and according to the law, persons became married by stating unequivocally to one another that they wished to wed one other. Consent was required, and having witnesses present was preferable, in case one of the parties later decided they didn't want to go through with the agreement. You might get married in a fairly straightforward manner. Most great medieval authors didn't write. We have a tendency to conceive of literacy as a single concept, but in reality, it encompasses a variety of distinct abilities, only one of which is the actual act of writing down text. During a significant portion of the Middle Ages, writing was considered a form of manual labor, and consequently, highly intelligent and influential people, such as theologians and intellectuals, did not waste their time writing on their own. Scribes were employed to do the writing for these individuals. Instead, they would use a scribe who would write down what the author dictated into a notebook. This was the equivalent of voice recognition software in the medieval era. Some people weren't very religious. The Middle Ages are historically known for having excellent examples of intense religiosity, such as mystics, saints, the flagellants, and mass pilgrimage. However, it would be incorrect to suppose that people have always placed a significant emphasis on God and religion, and it would be even more incorrect to believe that individuals living in the Middle Ages were incapable of engaging in skeptical reflection. There is compelling evidence that some common people questioned key doctrines, such as the authenticity of the miracles attributed to saints, the significance of the Eucharist, and the afterlife. A number of regular individuals came to the conclusion that the soul was nothing but blood, and when they reached the point of death, they simply vanished. Others believed that there was no valid reason to believe that God was responsible for the growth of plants and crops, and that it was instead the inherent qualities of cultivating and nourishing the soil that was responsible. There is also abundant evidence that demonstrates individuals are not worrying themselves very much with religious practices, most notably avoiding attending to church on Sundays. In the very early 14th century in Spain, one priest complained to his bishop that on Sundays, very few people went to church but instead spent their time playing in the streets. This took place in Spain. According to other statistics, it appears that at least a sizable proportion was able to find other ways to entertain themselves on Sunday mornings. They didn't believe the world was flat. Along with the fact that Viking helmets did not have horns, this is probably already common knowledge among the majority of people. Both of these statements, coupled with the notion that the Lord had the right to spend one night in bed with any newlywed woman, are examples of Victorian myth-making about the time period. The study of medieval history is fascinating for a number of reasons, one of which is that it requires you to solve the mystery of gleaning information from complicated and frequently fragmented sources that have survived. And another is that it requires you to continuously examine your own thinking to ensure that it does not contain any inherited prejudices or assumptions. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.